welcome to Sankofa Community Affairs. You're here with Brother Salim Adolfo, and today we are discussing liberation theology and, social justice ministry. We have Reverend Hagler. How you doing, sir?
Doing good. Good to have you here.
Thank
good
you
to be
for
here with
coming
you.
on, sir.
Thank you.
Like many of us, we grew up in the church, and many of our experiences, in the church are, at least for me, is the place where we go to not just worship, but oftentimes that's where we socialize. That's where we do a lot of just, developing, friendships and, building relationships. When you were growing up in the church, well, you said to me earlier that you didn't grow up in the church, but was that your view of the church? Because you grew up during the civil rights era. So was that something that you saw in the church during that time period, even though you necessarily didn't grow up in the church?
Well, I saw very largely the hypocrisy of the church.
Okay.
When I say the hypocrisy of the church, growing up in a community that was relatively poor, to often see the best dressed person in the community and with the biggest car being preacher. And there wasn't very much relationship between the church, even though the church was part of the community, from what I saw as the social issues of the time. Particularly, I think that when Martin King came along and other folks like in Baltimore, like Dobson's and all of that, that began to create a whole different transition, because now it was a ministry that became focused upon people being disenfranchised and how you began to work and organize and preach and teach for the enfranchisement of people. That made sense to me. The other stuff did not make a lot of sense to me. I didn't understand why preachers would be set apart like that, and why houses of worship would be these pristine communities when you've had a community falling down around it. So those kinds of contradictions I saw.
Did you think that the church evolved over time?
Well, I think that the church struggled, and struggled in time. I think there's always been points in which the church has struggled. So my viewpoint at that stage saw the church with this broad brush, when actually you had things going on in the spiritual movement of our community that was actually being far more critical, in a sense, far more liberationist in perspective. But generally, it was not necessarily the length and breadth of the community, but there were always these places, these oases of justice and truth-telling that continued to emerge in the midst of a sea where people were concerned about raising up those types of political issues.
Well, you're talking about raising political issues and raising consciousness. What actually is the definition of like a black liberation theology?
Well, basically liberation theology, and let me sort of broaden it out by liberation theology. I mean, there is always particular. So when you talk about black liberation theology, that's correct. But if you go to a place like Cuba, the churches are preaching about the Cuban reality. So they're not preaching about the whole world necessarily. They're preaching about the sort of the liberation of Cuba. Or like when I was in Mozambique years ago after Frelimo won, the churches there were speaking about the Mozambican reality. The churches in South Africa were speaking about the South African reality. And so in a sense, liberation theology is always particular to your historical location and to your environment, and also to the types of things that need to be addressed at the moment. So it's not necessarily a universal theology, but it's a very particular theology, and sometimes particular to a group of people, particular to a location, and so out of that, we seek to discover what the yearn for liberation is, what we need to be liberated from and liberated to.
What's the difference between liberation theology and prosperity preaching that we hear a lot about?
Well, it's two separate, complete opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, prosperity theology completely buys into the capitalist system. And so it really equates people's blessings with how much things you have, right? And so people become rich in things, and very often in debt because of those things. In order to, it's the old, can I keep up with the Jones type of mentality, right? I'm gonna count whether I can get a car as a blessing, whether I got a new suit as a blessing. So it has nothing to do really with liberation theology, because very often prosperity theology is very much individualistic. It looks at oneself and celebrates one's personal blessings. When you start talking about liberation theology, you're talking about a collectivism. You're talking about a community, right? It's the idea when we talk about salvation in a liberation salvationist perspective, yeah, you can talk about you being saved, but the reality is your salvation is dependent upon the salvation of everybody else, right?
Correct.
I mean, so you can't be separate from everybody else. So your hopes, your aspirations have to be larger than just you. It has to be related and connected to your community.
Why did you choose to embed social justice into your ministry?
Well, I don't think I chose it. I think it's there inherent in the gospel. I mean, I think what happens very often is people avoid it. People don't want to deal with it. People want to dance to something else, talk about get to heaven. But even Jesus at his inaugural address, if we can take it as his inaugural address, opens the scroll to the book of Isaiah and recites these words. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and announce the acceptable year of the Lord." You notice he didn't say that I've come to preach to the 1% or to come to heal the rich. He says, I've come for the poor, the oppressed, the blind. And that's the perspective. And that particularism is exactly liberation theology. It says, I've come for this group, right? I haven't come necessarily for the whole world. I've come for this group that the whole world has victimized.
Do you get the support of the church? Because I know some churches, they're more concerned with what the minister or the head pastor is able to bring in terms of resources or our numbers growing. But, some churches seem to be more involved and engaged in the community. Do you find that your church really supports that kind of teaching?
My members have supported me in terms of my endeavors, and they have been engaged in many endeavors as well. But that was a learning curve, because I think that one of the things is, in being a historian, I even look at the church from a historical perspective. Plymouth's been around since 1881.
Wow.
It was founded by the same organization that helped found Howard University, which was the American Missionary Association, particularly the Div School. And so in that, Plymouth was the heart of the black community, and if you go to Washington, D.C., right outside of DuPont Circle, Northwest Washington, at 17th and P, that was where Plymouth was originally sited. This is only its second building. But it served as one of the centers of the black community, and it served as a place of empowerment in the midst of a segregated society, a segregated world. What happens as the church moves into the 50s and the 60s, and sort of people are not are becoming freer within the culture, is that the church eventually then dissolves and devolves, I should use, into a social club. And so then it becomes a thing of status rather than a thing of change, and rather than a thing of empowerment. And so then that has to be undone, and to create a whole nother vision for the church. And so the church thrived at one point on really just being able to celebrate being black and middle class. And then out of that you have to move the church in order sort of understanding what the gospel is about. But every single church goes through those types of ups and downs, right? I mean, I was talking to one of my pastor's friends at First Baptist, which was founded on the campgrounds and during the Civil War, right? I mean, so you got churches with long history in Washington, D.C., and that long history gives you a snapshot of the different waves that the church has gone through in order to continue to thrive and continue to survive.
All right, we need to take a break, and we're going to come back and touch on that, because the history of the church, especially in the black community, is very deep. And I think if people study the history of the church and what it's actually contributed to the well-being of the community, it'll give them a different appreciation, for the church, even if they don't necessarily attend church now. You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Slim Adolfo. We'll be right back.
Yes, you are. Come here. Let's see how this looks.
Hey, how's my little horse?
She's a lion.
Yes, she is.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Welcome back to Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Slim Adolfo. We are here with Reverend Hagler. We're discussing, social justice ministry. And one of the things that we talked about in the last segment was the importance of understanding and appreciating the history and the role of the church, especially coming up out of slavery. Can you touch on that, please?
Well, I mean, the church has always, has been a kind of gathering center. which has also contributed to the church's ability and power to move and change things. If you think about it, right? I mean, it was like doing people want to criticize sort of the aspirations of particularly Christianity, because they say, well, the slave master would go and tell folks that this is a scripture that you got to be obedient to, which was true. But there was also a defiance to that took place outside of the master's eye. I mean, that's another important thing, such as Nat Turner, who calls folks and baptizes them on the night of the uprising, right? Because the slave master thought that they were doing one thing, and those who were enslaved said, no, right? And I remember also reading, particularly with Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman would talk about when he came home from seminary, he would read to his grandmother who couldn't read or write, who had been also enslaved. And every time that he would go and he would read from Paul, she would just get herself together, stand up, and walk away. Never said anything. He'd be left reading. So he finally asked her, he said, why do you walk away every time I read Paul? And his grandmother said, because the slave masters would call us together and read, slaves, be obedient to your master. And I vowed if I ever got free, I wasn't going to sit still and listen to those words any longer. Right? So she got up and walked away, literally and figuratively. So the church has always been a critiquing place, and particularly the black church, because it was really outside of the viewpoint of slave masters very often, because they just thought we were doing our superstitious thing, right? When a lot of the hymns came out of periods of enslavement, a lot of the spirituals that we know of, like steal away, steal away to Jesus, right? Ain't just stealing away to Jesus. You're getting ready to break out of the plantation. You're getting ready to make a run for it, right? And you're passing the word. I mean, all those types of things that began to emerge. And so what has happened is the church was a defiance place because people gathered. And so, therefore, it was natural that if anything was really going to be organized of strength in the civil rights era, it had to come out of the church, where people gathered week after week. People gathered for midweek prayer. People gathered for Sunday worship. People gathered. They were used to being together. They were used to trying to hear what saith the Lord. And if the Lord talked about liberation, then people began to think about that. It's just like, I don't know if you know the name Vernon Johns, but Vernon Johns was another almost self-educated brother, preacher, right? And so, you know, he was one of those folks that always agitated, was fired from most of the places that he agitated. But what he ended up doing was making room, and in his pastorate, as he got fired from the church, folks thought that they had brought in a more conservative preacher by the name of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and because they were so glad to get rid of Vernon Johns. Right. So you always got prophets who open doors. You got prophets who shake things up. You got prophets who make a way. A lot of times people don't remember them, but they're the ones that have opened the doors for others to come through.
Well, I think you bring up a good point that I really must, touch on, is that many of our liberation movements, you mentioned Nat Turner. I can't think of at no point in time did we ever have a liberation movement here in the West in which a minister wasn't in the forefront of it, or at least there wasn't a minister who was someone who was counseled, that counseled somebody who may have been in the forefront. We talk about, the Haitian Revolution, where they were practicing, maybe traditional forms of African spirituality, but nonetheless there was a minister there. Then we, fast forward up into the Civil Rights era, you had Martin Luther King, even minister, Malcolm X. So I think that understanding how we move, especially as an African people, we're definitely in tune with spirituality, and that at some place and point in time, there is going to be someone of the cloth, per se, that is going to be engaged in what we're doing if we're, talking about getting free. But speaking of a group of ministers, you worked with a group of ministers for, was it social, economic, and racial justice? Can you tell us about that, please?
It was called the Ministers for Racial, Social, and Economic Justice. I was the president of it for 8 years, which is a national group of clergy that sort of focus on those issues around civil rights, economic justice, all of those types of things. And basically, it was a group, and it is a group that continues to agitate, particularly also to mobilize clergy to begin to, and to continue to advocate in their local communities, whatever those issues are going on in the local communities. One of the things that's important is that one of the things that disturbs me is when I hear people very often say, well, I don't do organized religion.
Okay.
Right. And the reason it disturbs me is because when we start talking about those movements, like in Haiti and other places, that came out of organization.
Right.
And it also, the reason you had spiritual folks engaged, whether they were Christian or whether they were Muslim or whether they of traditional African religion, is because that was a group of folks that, in a sense, that was there and intersected with people's needs and knew where people were and felt the pain of people, and also at the same time really philosophized around the things that they saw and they felt and that they heard, and therefore were able to, in a sense, organize. So the important thing is not so much the people's abhorrence of organized religion, it's what people allow people who are leaders of those houses of faith to get away with. I mean, the people need to hold faith leaders accountable. It's sort of like, what are you doing to change reality? It's just like we can talk about mega churches all we want. And people flock to them. People go to the mega church. They love the mega churches. Why hasn't a mega church taken over a congressional district? They got enough people in their church. Why haven't they taken over? Right. So the issue is they're sitting there doing what? Right. They're political. They got political power in there that they have not activated, have not bothered to activate. Now I can bet you they'll get all upset if some issue come out about homosexuality. But they didn't get upset when people were being thrown out of their homes because the banks had cheated them out of their homes. So you got to begin to raise the question of where is really our moral upsetness, our moral outrage, and how do we begin to get so skewered by it, right? I mean, it's just like we should be able to change political districts. I always remind the church when we were going through stuff, when I came to Plymouth, there were unlicensed nightclubs, and there were people being shot every single weekend. And I took on that issue. And so members of the church at that point were frightened. And so I had to remind them, I said, look, I said, understand this. I said, we're here on this corner of North Capitol and Riggs. We are the gang. This is our turf. We control this turf. We don't allow anybody to come up in here on our turf and take a life without hearing from us. And that's the way we began to think about it, that we were the gang. We had a purpose of being there, had a reason to control the neighborhood, had a reason to try to make sure that people were able to live in that community. And so that's what we did. And so it's a part of changing people's mentality to say, you're not a bystander. We are here, we're gathered together, we're organized, we got resources to change things, to make a difference. So that's where I focus upon it all the time.
Okay, well, we need to take another break. You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. We'll be right back.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
Welcome back to Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. We're here with Reverend Hagler of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., just discussing Black liberation theology, but liberation theology as a whole, but also just social justice within the ministry. Something that you mentioned a few minutes ago was that many of these churches, they bring in a lot of money, like the mega churches. But this is something I always discuss with a lot of my friends who are, we're always talking about economic development. Where does the money go that churches collect on Sunday? When they go to make that deposit on Monday, are they putting them in banks outside of our community, or are they putting them in banks inside our community?
I mean, usually, in a sense, it probably depends on church to church. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of money is going into entities that we control, right, if any at all. Let's be honest with that. And so part of that is also, when you look at it, why haven't we developed things, and particularly mega churches that got the resources to do it, to create revolving loan funds for people who want to develop things, want to develop businesses, want to develop entrepreneurships, right? There should be a revolving, that's where you put your money back into the community so that it serves and allows the people's lives to be bettered. And those are the types of things that really sort of require some vision to do, and also to get people out of the idea that you just have money in the bank to buy a jet plane for a pastor. What pastor need a jet plane for? What does a pastor need a helicopter for? What does a pastor need a Rolls Royce for? You don't need any of that stuff. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to be about the business of liberation and empowerment and justice. That's what we're called to do.
So do you think that many people, like in my family, I hate to admit it, but my grandmother would watch these guys, these televangelists, and she would want to send money to them because she felt compelled. I guess they touched her in some kind of way. But why aren't more churches, doing just that, just nation building, helping to build institutions? Now, I know there are some that are doing it.
Some that are doing it.
And I don't want to say that no church is not doing anything in the community, but, I feel as though the churches, could be doing more.
We could be doing a lot more. I mean, that's the reality. Unfortunately, because very often we have what I call a theology of the status quo. It's not a theology that that critiques things. I'll give you a point of view. Years ago, Rick Warren came out with his book, Purpose-Driven Church, which was related to purpose-driven life. And a lot of church groups were studying it. When you read Purpose-Driven Church in the preface of the book, there's a problem. There's a theological flaw. And his argument is that there is culture, and God sends the waves of culture. And the preacher's job is like a surfer to ride the wave. So if people are caught up in this, you ride the wave and you exploit it and you attract people into the church. Well, the problem with that, the theological flaw is that the cultural wave has been racism. The cultural wave has been sexist. The cultural wave has been naked capitalism that has destroyed people over and over again. So the preacher's called, from his estimation, the preacher's called to ride those tidal waves of destruction and bring people in. No, that's not it. The issue is our theology, the Christian theology, the gospel theology, not only just the gospel theology, but I think there's a universal voice that comes out of spiritual things, that it challenges the culture. It questions the culture. It questions particularly the things that destroy human life and that destroys justice and that destroys people in terms of their own empowerment and existence. There's always a critique, and the important thing is that we got to have a word that critiques what is going on around us, because if it's not critiqued, there will be no justice. Because in a sense, we all ride towards greedy things. We all ride towards selfishness. We all ride towards nurturing our own group. Right. Against everybody else. There has to be a critique.
Well, I would feel, remiss if we, have a conversation about liberation theology, and I don't mention Albert Klieg of the Shrine of the Black Madonna, Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church. They've created cultural centers. They have farmland. They have schools. They have housing. Why do you think that model hasn't carried on to some other entities? I mean, even the Nation of Islam, it's still a form of a spiritual, organization, and they've done similar things. Why do you believe many other institutions haven't taken up that model?
Part of it comes out of the sort of the historical context. I mean, it's like the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam, in a sense, become a version of North American Islam. Okay. Right? I mean, it's just like when you're there with the minister, and the minister quotes the gospel and then quotes the Quran, right? And it sort of goes hand in hand, because, in a sense, that comes out of where we are at that historical moment in which it was created. And so it has a whole set of different assumptions. It automatically emerged as being anti-empire. It had a critique of racism. Okay. It had a critique of the types of segregation that was taking place. It had a critique of white supremacy. So from almost its inception, it had a critique of those things. It's just like with the Shrine of the Black Madonna. It had a critique of those things. Well, mainstream Christianity in North America did not have a critique of those things, right? In a sense, it's like James Cone, who's one of the liberation theologians. He's got it's an older book now, but it's a good book. I don't know why it didn't get the acclaim that I felt it should have got, but the book is called Malcolm and Martin in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Right. One of my favorite books. Great book, because he talks about the ideological assumptions that each emerges out of, and why therefore their positions would be slightly different, not because of necessarily who they are, but the ideological stream that they came out of. And it's important to sort of be able to understand that things in a sense emerge not at the same time and not in the same way, and because they emerge in a different context, they all have different perspectives with which to approach the world with.
Well, Rev, we're running out of time. Thank you for coming on. Can you tell the people how to get in touch with you?
Well, you can get in touch with me. You can actually go to plymouth-ucc.org. That's one way to get in touch with me. I'm also on Facebook under Reverend Hagler. You can get me at Twitter under Reverend Hagler as well. So, and also we gather at 4 p.m. At another church called Community of All People in Reston, Virginia. We're meeting right now at the Washington Plaza Baptist Church at Lake Ann at 4 p.m. on Sundays.
Okay. Thank you for coming on. We'll have to definitely get you back on.
All right. Look forward to it.
Yes. Thank you for watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adolfo. Make sure you check us out on the web at nationalblackunitedfront.org. Check out our Feed the Hood project, the Enjoy Where You See Saturday School, and our Sankofa study circles. See you next week. Peace.